just giving people a few minutes to make their way in from the waiting room. So thank you for your patience. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our chat this morning with Michael Pascoe to unpack what was a very interesting budget that was handed down last night by this current federal government. I'd like to start this morning by acknowledging that I'm joining you from the land of the Camaragal people, the traditional owners of this land, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We're incredibly lucky this morning to have Michael Pascoe joining us, and I'm sure he needs little to no introduction, but Michael is one of the most experienced finance and economics commentators in our country. He is known for his independence and straight shooting and for looking beyond the obvious headlines. He's been covering budgets for more than 4 decades in newspapers, radio and television. And Michael is now a contributing editor for The New Daily, a free news online newspaper. We're delighted to have his analysis this morning. Michael, I'm going to literally hand straight to you because, as you know, the main purpose of this chat this morning is for myself to hear at the same time and in real terms the insights that you took from last night's budget. And then at the end of your presentation, what we'll do is have a little bit of a chat about some of the things that I saw and concerned me and some questions that I have about the way that business planning and budget management are actually done in our country. So without any further ado, over to you.
Ali, thanks very much. Thanks for this opportunity of running through the budget, the things that really interested me along the way. The main job of journalists in a budget lockup isn't really to look at the numbers, it's to come up with some sort of a headline. That's your first priority. It tends to be a bit of groupthink, and if you look around the newspapers this morning, you'll see that most people have gone with a variation of the cash splash. Well, yeah, that's a bit obvious, but I think there's a bit more to it than there. Technology willing, I will now attempt to, oh, look, I've got a slide deck. What more could you want along the way? The wonderful David Rowe in the Financial Review has the cost of living with Scotty, and with the detail Rowe puts into a cartoon, he, I think, summarises most of the cash flash ideas all in one effort. However, I think that's not the best headline. For me, this is the pea and thimble budget, because the money that you see isn't necessarily where you think it is, and it disappears awfully quickly. Most people missed it. Ross Gittins didn't trust Ross. He's actually covered more budgets than I have. And I'm never going to be able to catch up, that's for sure. What Ross saw was the sleight of hand, Frydenberg's disappearing cash trick. And it is absolutely extraordinary. In the immediate coverage, a lot of people were reporting that $420 tax break for this year. That was a way to disguise a tax increase. An increase in the low to middle income tax offset from $1,080 to $1,500, but it's only for this year, and then it's scrapped. There's a $1,500 tax break for the election, and then most Australians actually pay more tax. Now, I have never seen something as cynical as that in the 40 odd years that I've been looking at budgets, and I've seen some cynical plays over the time. It's that particular sleight of hand summarises the core mission of this budget, and that is to buy votes and skate on through. I think the government knows they've lost this election, and Josh Frydenberg is desperately trying to save some deck chairs, including his own furniture in Kylea. Until I saw that particular trick, I thought the most cynical thing about the budget was undermining clearly the purpose of superannuation. It was the little deal to extend the 50% discount on what self-funded retirees have to withdraw from their super accounts, so that if you're 70, whole pile of money in super, you only have to withdraw 2.5% of it. Now, the point of super is meant to be living comfortably in retirement, not a wealth, intergenerational wealth management tool. Well, Josh Frydenberg indicated for his base, the people he's trying to keep on side, that's what he's about. There were some bigger factors, though. I don't want to get bogged down in a whole pile of ugly numbers like all those numbers on your screen, but last night I did find the little hidden message that a Treasury economist managed to sneak into the budget papers. This is what everyone's reporting. As you can see, the headline GDP growth. This financial year that ends on June 30, it is a very strong bounce back, 4.25% GDP growth. That is excellent. It's wonderful. We're very fortunate to have it. And then you get into the 2 years of forecasting, 3.5% in the new financial year looks damn flash. That's, again, a good number. And falling to 2.5% in 2023-24, yeah, you wouldn't get too excited about that. However, this budget is so cynical that the numbers have been fiddled with and stacked to give presentable headlines to the new financial year. What I discovered, tucked away in the fine print, is what the calendar years look like. Hang in here, hang in there with me on this. This might sound arcane, but it's really important. In terms of the calendar year, yeah, this year's good, 4.75% growth. It's going to be a ripper, and there are reasons that everyone should know about for that. A lot of money has been socked away with overcompensation during COVID. Also, people unable to spend as much as they'd like to, people unable to travel overseas, where Australians love spending very heavily. So that's there in this calendar year. But look at 2023, 2% growth. That is substandard. What happens is we boom this year and we burn a hole next year. The budget has been fiddled to have a bit of a pull forward in numbers into the second half of this calendar year and into the first half of 2024, leaving us in danger of a quite dispiriting fallback in economic growth in 2023. And also, just in passing, there was a lot of talk last night how Australia is leading the world and we're doing best and all that sort of business. Well, in 2023, look how we perform. We beat Japan, but Japan's always low growth. We actually are falling well behind once the election is out of the way. We're into the next year. On this ugly page of numbers, and I promise I won't get rid of it, you can begin to see why if you look at some of the detail. Dwelling investment, what we spend on housing, has soared. The pull forward that's been brought on by the home builder program, it comes to an end. And the backlog in building projects shows that in 2023-24, we actually begin to go backwards. I think it's worse than that. Business investment in 23-24 is only 1%. That's miserable. That is pathetic. Non-mining investment is where most of that blame is. Again, that 9% figure, when you remember what the calendar year is for 2023, most of that has been pulled forward by tax breaks, but there's only so many new laptops and Hiluxes you can buy, which is why we have miserable non-mining investment out the other side. Before I leave this page, let's just go down to the important stuff of what is being pretended about wages growth. I will come back to it, but have a look here. A prediction that inflation in the new financial year will be 3% and the wage price index will be 3.25%. The government is claiming there will be growth in real wages for the first time in the thick end of a decade. That's not quite true, but I'll come back to that. What we are seeing in this budget is the disaster of saying can-do capitalism will do it all. And that there's been no need to build back better or build back stronger. Scott Morrison has specifically, explicitly said he's not interested in building back better. Well, he's achieved that. The trouble is that can-do capitalism isn't doing it. Business investment has been on the slide for a decade. This graph is exaggerated by the impact of the mining boom, but even leaving out the resources industry, non-mining investment has been substandard for a decade, and it's not changing. It's picked up a little bit, but not much. And if you look at what has happened in terms of the cost to business to borrow to invest, the large businesses, money has been free. Large business has been able to borrow for less than 2%. Now, with inflation running at more than 2%, in real terms, this money is free. And that has not been enough to generate the nation building, sustainable growth that would power us on. A little bit of history. Going into the stimulus during COVID, just about every economist in the country was saying, go for social housing. It would pay a lasting dividend. It would be building back better. That, education and training and infrastructure. Well, what happened? Well, instead of social housing, we got home builder. $2.1 billion, which mainly went to people who really didn't need it. About 30% of the home builder grants in New South Wales went to people who are renovating. If you are spending between $150,000 and $750,000 on a renovation, you didn't need 25 grand from the government, but that's where it went. That has brought forward a lot of building activity. It has worsened inflation in housing building and not helped beyond the short term. If that had gone into social housing, it would have been a lasting investment for the country instead of just a handout to the lucky few. And the reality is, we don't have a housing crisis. It is much worse than that, as I've written about. In large parts of this country, there is no availability of rental housing. Hobart, 0.2%, Canberra, 0.5%, Brisbane, 0.8%. In effective terms, there is no available housing. And of course, affordable housing is simply not there. And as you can see in this graph, home builder pulled forward dwelling unit approvals, but as that runs its course, approvals are falling right off. Once the backlog in the system is cleared, we have that fall off in housing and dwelling commencements and the contribution to the economy. Meanwhile, public housing has been frozen for a decade. State-owned public housing has actually been falling, matched by a little uptick in community housing. The budget did mention a program that might add 10,000 social housing units. Given the scale of the problem, that's nothing. Given population growth, we are still going backwards. It is one of, for my money, one of our two biggest problems in this nation. The government is spending a whole pile of money on the Commonwealth Rent Assistance Program. In the last financial year, it was actually $5.3 billion in real money, real terms. That effectively is a subsidy for private landlords. It looks like it's helping people who can't afford the rent. Really, it is subsidising the private landlord market at the bottom of the market. Infrastructure. You might have noticed some of the ads that have been targeted at various different ads for different states, for different electorates. It's been a furphy, basically. That promise of building our future, of the government spending more money on infrastructure, has been pea and thimble. Let me run you through it. His first budget, 2019, Josh the Builder announced a record $100 billion transport infrastructure commitment. In the fine print, it's over 10 years, so it's $10 billion a year. In real terms, it was no advance on what Joe Hockey was promising back in 2014, and it is less than what Labor was spending last time they were in power. In 2020, he did this, remember, was COVID stimulus. He increased the $10 billion a year to $11 billion a year. that's 110 billion over 10 years, only $1 billion a year extra with a little bit of pull forward. That 14 billion in new and accelerated infrastructure was a con job. And in 2021, he was doing it again. He announced, tonight we make 15 billion in additional infrastructure commitments. He didn't. There was no increase in spend. It was still 110 over 10 years. Last night, well, before last night, there was the announcement of $18 billion, a little bit more truth in saying it was existing and new infrastructure commitments. They're over many years, and there was an increase in that 110 to 120 over 10 years. But guess what? To go from 100 billion to 120 over a time period of 13 years, 2032, when this decade finishes, that's an increase of only 1.5% a year on a compound basis, much less than inflation. It is smoke and mirrors, it's deceit. The federal government is not increasing in real terms its spend on infrastructure in this nation. Thankfully, we have states, because the states are doing by way and beyond most of the heavy lifting. We do have an infrastructure transport boom underway. It will peak at about $50 billion in constant dollars, most of it paid for by the states. And thank heavens for that, because as you can see in this graph from Macro Monitor, non-residential building is coming off, houses coming off, mining isn't doing much. Aside from the infrastructure spend, real growth by the states, we're in a spot of bother. I want to point out a couple of things that you won't read anywhere else, and that underlines the continued lack of investment in the future, which is my main complaint about the Morrison government over its 4 budgets, that it's short-term, it's can-do capitalism, having faith in sugar hits for the economy doing all the work. This is tucked away in the fine print of the budget papers, where economists managed to sneak in the truth. Expenses under higher education, universities basically, will decrease by 5.4% in real terms from the current financial year to next year, and then continue to decrease in real terms. Higher education, the future of the nation, is not getting any help from this government. It's being sent backwards. For that matter, another area that was smacked hard by the pandemic, that broad concept of recreation and culture, going backwards by 7.9% in real terms into the new financial year, and then continuing to slide by nearly 14% out to 25-26. And within that broader picture, broadcasting, alias the ABC and SBS, it in real terms is also continuing to be frozen. The ABC was delighted to do a deal not to actually be cut in nominal dollars, but in real terms, they're still going backwards. And just in the housing sub-function, in real terms, a big decrease as home builder falls off, and then nothing to help fill the gap, that hole that's been dug by pulling forward private building with home builder, as we face an absolute public housing catastrophe. So what about our biggest economic domestic challenge? And that is substandard wage rises. I did an exercise with the 2021 wage price index and inflation. Someone on the average Australian wage, which is only 62,400, if they were in the public sector in 2021, they had a 2.1% wage rise. Everyone forgets about the impact of tax. A 2.1% pre-tax rise works out to be an increase of only 1.7% in your take-home pay. The inflation rate in 2021 was 3.5%. So your average digger on 62 grand a year had their real take-home pay, they lost half of that increase. It's actually worse than it looks, because that overlooks the interaction with the transfer system for anyone in about the bottom quarter of the economy. Remember the national wage case last year, a 2.5% rise in the minimum wage. Well, in this example, if you're a single income couple with one child aged 3, of the nominal $18.80 extra a week you'd get if you were a full-time worker, you would actually only get $5.70 in your pocket. That's where the real high marginal income tax rate is, not at the top end of the game, but at the bottom. I went through the numbers last night. Josh Frydenberg is promising a 3.25% lift in the wage price index in 2023, but that's only 2.8% after tax, when inflation is predicted to be 3%. There are a lot of headlines around. A lot of journalists have fallen for this before. They continue to fall for it. They're claiming, oh, there will be an increase in real wages next financial year. No, there's not. After tax, you go backwards. Oh, no. How did I manage to include a headline pointing out the corruption in our political system? Rather than me, I thought, let's use the Financial Review for a change. Just on that headline $17.9 billion infrastructure splurge, as the Financial Review points out, it is absolutely overweight in marginal seats. Good luck to the people in Dobell up there in the Central Coast. You're getting heaps. Robertson, held by Labor next door, not much. This is no news to readers of the New Daily. Over the past 2 years, we have been tracking the extent of corruption in federal government. Sports frauds was actually the least of it. The Commonwealth development grants, $4 billion in total since they were invented in 2014, specifically to deliver corrupt political patronage, has just rolled on. A quick example from our first story on Commonwealth development grants, how they were handled out. In the Hunter, it's pretty obvious, isn't it? The National Party seats all copped it. Hunter, held by Labor, 0.1%. It pays to be in a marginal seat or a coalition seat. This is not governing for the benefit of the nation, and it's continued. Over the last 2 years on the New Daily, and my partner in crime here, Vince O'Grady, he's counted up $4.3 billion in Rorts Central. So what do we end up with? A cynical budget, a budget which is not doing what it should be doing for the country, a budget which is about short-term vote buying, exactly what people, you don't have to be cynical, just healthily skeptical, suspected was going to happen. The cash splash, as Ross Gittins pointed out, the government hopes people think that there's a big cash splash. They would want people to think this election is up for grabs, because they won't look beyond it the next financial year and see the hole that is opening up for them. They won't see that we are not building back better. We are not taking advantage of all that government's stimulus that's been thrown around. We're leaving it to can-do capitalism that isn't doing it, because big investment needs to have faith in a government commitment to growth, and it's not there. You see it in the lack of commitment to dealing with climate change. There is not the commitment. You see it on the crisis in public housing. No, we don't want to know about it. And that's a common problem at all levels of government, certainly at state government level too. And so we have had a budget which throws up the headlines, certainly tosses around the money. I think it's desperate. I think it's cynical. There's a lot more detail that backs up my argument, but you've all seen the headlines in the newspapers. That's what we've got. Sorry to be cynical, sorry to be depressing about it, Kylie, but this is about having a happy little time up to and beyond the election. and then falling in a hole in 2023. But I really don't think the coalition believes it's going to be there, and therefore it's not its problem. Ha!
So, Michael, thank you. Thank you so much for that. And there was so much in what you just talked about that definitely confirmed, unfortunately, what I thought I was seeing and hearing last night and what I've been reading overnight in terms of, some of the more reliable commentary and the deeper seeking commentary. I guess before we go into I have a few questions for you. One of the things I didn't see huge evidence of in the budget last night was a strong indicator that we are working to transition our economy to a focus away from fossil fuels and towards a future which is based on renewable, sustainable, high-tech manufacturing even, or energy. Did I just miss it, or was there budget in there somewhere? Yeah, was there budget in there somewhere I didn't see?
No, you didn't miss it. It wasn't there. There's no advance on the dirty deal done to win over the National Party for a nominal zero by 2050. So far out in the horizon, no one can see it. That was done before Glasgow. There's no advance. And given the scandal that's erupted with the exposure of the carbon credits fraud, it's just an embarrassment to the government. That disclosure by the good professor in the last few days blows apart the spending that is there. So no, we're not going forward, we're going backwards.
I noted you made the point that in an education terms and schools development terms, that actually there are no gains for our kids and the future that we're putting towards them. Yet I do recall that was quite a big headline earlier this week, that the government was investing heavily in skills development through TAFE. Is that just another sleight of hand?
There's a bit more skullduggery involved in that. The budget is counting a lot of the incentives for subsidising employers for training their staff. In real terms, TAFE is basically standing still. I have not been able to get into the detail of that proposed spending, because when it's proposal, it's still a long way away, to see how much of it is being counted, the subsidy for employers as opposed to spending on training. It's any sort of training at all is being counted there, not necessarily some of the more technical skills that we definitely need. So look, the headline's there, the government is spending in training, but the quality of that training, I think, is dubious. And the real terms growth over the estimates is basically marking time.
Another key driver of domestic growth is productivity. And so my question to you is, did we see any signals from the government last night that they are looking at addressing the high costs of childcare for families in terms of getting families back into the workforce faster?
No advance on announced policy. That is, you've got to have more than one child to get anything under their policy announced last year, and so it's still deficient. One of the challenges, though, tucked away in the numbers, is that the participation rate remains high, at a record high, but it's stable. Somehow or other, magically, we are meant to have more women in the workforce, more parents in the workforce, at the same time that ageing begins to take out some of the older participants, without an obvious way of increasing the number of people working in childcare. It's a little bit like aged care as well. No mention of an increase in pay for aged care workers, and yet we're meant to magically have a lot more people in that sector. That's another catastrophe underway. People are working on substandard wages. They are going backwards in real terms. You can't get workers to keep turning up when there is better pay elsewhere in the economy. So that is a bigger problem that's still out there. However, individuals are funded for aged care and for childcare, you've got to get the workers. And the government is showing no inclination to want to pay for it.
So that was something I heard a lot made of last night, that in fact, getting an unemployment rate down to, a level where there's a number 3 in front of it will actually be the trigger to drive the wages growth. I heard that kind of, repeated consistently last night, that this isn't a government strategy per se in terms of providing that impetus. It's actually a supply and demand kind of scenario. My question to that, though, is at what point do you simply just not have the people in the country to do the work that needs to be done?
In some areas, we already don't have the people to do the work. And they are the areas that are seeing quite good wages growth. If you're in the right technical areas, you can get a wage rise. But a lot of Australians are on 3-year enterprise deals and they don't get a wage rise. And then there are a lot more Australians working in aged care, for example, where the employers just aren't making with the money, because it comes back to what the government's prepared to pay them to subsidise work, and that is not being increased. The government is standing aloof from the wage case in aged care and hospitals, not making an argument because it's out beyond when they're going to be in government, I cynically suspect. So that's the depressing part of it. Some areas of the economy that are hot, yes, there is wages growth. And there's a tricky thing here, Kylie, that is some of the areas where there's a shortage of labour, where employers are complaining loudest and looking to fill that gap with immigration again and with temporary workers, the way they have for many years, and that's most obvious in the hospitality industry. That is coming back. Certainly there are incentives to get immigration and temporary work visas up to where they were again. But from an economic point of view, there is a harsh reality if you're trying to lift living standards, if you're trying to get real income growth. And that is the businesses that can't afford to pay more, that are not efficient, are forced to become more efficient one way or the other, and that lifts our national productivity. When there is a shortage of any good, whether it's bananas or workers, the price goes up, and those who can afford to pay it do, and they get what they want. Those that are inefficient can't, and they fall by the wayside, freeing up resources. I've got a local restaurant which is very well run, a very efficient restaurant. They're short of staff. Moussaka has fallen off the menu. It is a Greek restaurant and there's no moussaka. I said, how can this be? And the very intelligent fellows who run it explained that there is actually a lot more prep time for moussaka than other dishes. And so while they're short-staffed, they've had to ditch it. That's actually a productivity enhancement. It's a tiny, silly example, but it's what needs to happen if we are to lift real wages, if we are to get the productivity growth that you do when the blowtorch is applied to the belly.
So I have a question coming from that, because obviously that does imply some sort of evolution or transition on business space over time. Productivity improves those that exist, and that leaves opportunity to create new. There was mention in the budget last night of the modern manufacturing strategy by this government. I really struggled to find any detail when I dug deeper. It seemed to be very much words without specific actions. Again, what did I miss?
What did we all miss? Not just you. Look, the government has a number of programs that sound good, and if you are a business that is good at writing applications, you can score well. Let me give you an example from recent history of manufacturing getting a government handout. I don't know if you drink Four Pines beer, brewed in Manly. they received a government grant of $700 and something thousand to improve their bottling line. Four Pines Brewery is owned by the world's biggest brewer. The taxpayer is subsidising an improvement in their bottling plant as part of our modern economy. This is silly. This is ridiculous, but it's those sorts of grants, as well as good ones and genuine ones, that go into the mix when you're getting desperate to be seen to do something. It's a usual thing that businesses that are good at writing grant applications and can milk the system will do well. Does it lift the economy overall? I'm not convinced you get too much bang for your buck. Some good things get done, a lot doesn't, and it's small beer.
Well, and to be clear, it's not bottling other brewers' beer. This is simply a single company benefiting from that gift to improve their facilities. And a large company. Okay.
Which is really an example of the hodgepodge nature of grants and gifts, select lobbies, individuals, companies, that has blossomed over this government. There are so many dodgy grants, and I pointed to some of them earlier on, that are there for the grabbing if you're in the right electorate, if you can tick the boxes and you've got someone who's good at filling out grant application forms. It's not what I would consider the business of federal government to be giving out. Some grants they hand out are as small as $1,000 for odds and sods routine. Now, it would cost more to prepare a submission, to have public servants consider and rate that submission. The economic cost would be as big as the grant when you get down to that level. Now, the whole grant system has been bastardised, and there are questions about what is the role of federal government, how far down into the economy should they be fiddling, when it's the role of local government and state government that should be dealing with it. And given the political targeting of grants right across the system, I think it's corrupt.
Let's talk for a minute, and I can see actually Brett has asked a question that I was just coming to. So thank you, Brett. There was lots of noise last night about the government halving the fuel excise tax from its 44 cents down to 22 cents. And from my perspective, the question I want to ask, though, is what measures or what indicators did we see in the budget last night that we are actually seriously taking a transition to electric vehicles, so moving away from these fossil fuel dependent vehicles, the ICEs, and instead moving ourselves to infrastructure that supports EVs, or incentives to buy an EV over an internal combustion engine. Did you see any of that in the budget, Michael?
Not, and halving the excise heads in the other direction. Other countries buy better and cheaper electric vehicles because they have policy to encourage it. That's been well documented, and it was a big feature in last year's budget in a lot of ways. That the comparison of Australian policy and major markets overseas, where the pressure is put on manufacturers to become more fuel efficient, and that means provide more electric vehicles. We don't have that in this country. Consequently, we are at the end of the queue to get EVs. And this handout, look, I buy petrol. I don't have an electric vehicle. Okay, I'll admit it. I love my internal combustion engine. But that aside, this sends a message of don't worry about it. The government is still in your carbon burning space.
You know what, Michael, you are absolutely allowed to love your internal combustion engine. As somebody who actually would like to convert to an EV, though, and move, on with my family, it's so difficult to get access to them. And simple market indicators such as improved fuel emissions standards, dropping the luxury car tax. I mean, there are things this federal government buying electric vehicles as part of the federal government fleet. If the government said from tomorrow, every public car that is bought will be an electric vehicle, we would actually see significantly improved rates of EV uptake and a transition for ourselves.
We are at the back of the queue for the good electric vehicles, simply because we are not matching the policy of major markets overseas. And therefore, manufacturers will continue to target their least fuel efficient vehicles at the Australian market.
No, I see there's another question that's come in on the chat, and I know the answer to this one, but I'm going to ask it because I would like everybody. ICAC, did we see funding last night in the budget for a Federal Integrity Commission?
Out there in the Never Never land, there are policies that that exist, but like other issues that are in the deferred basket, no. You know, the funding is there, but the will isn't. It's been tucked away at the back of the budget papers. There's the Never Never section of the budget papers. Similarly, there was money still sitting there to be used for Indigenous recognition in the Constitution. That is too hard for the government to come to. A federal ICAC is in the same basket. The money's there, has been there, but there's no political will to have a real one, and you wonder why.
Michael, thank you. I'm very conscious we're coming to the end of our time this morning. We have just a couple of minutes, but I would ask you to indulge me, please. As you know, I don't come from a political background. I'm a business person, and I've run and built businesses over the last 35 years. And in my whole time working, the reality has been, when it comes to doing something successfully, the process has been to write a strategy that is a long-term vision of where you want to take your business. So usually a minimum of 5 years, 5 to 10 years. And then the process is that you do develop a budget, but that budget is developed annually. It's then your performance against it is tracked annually. And then based on your performance of your prior year's budget, you can help inform and build your subsequent year's budget. Am I just so naive that I don't see the evidence of that very basic business process in our federal government? Because from what I saw last night, I can't find a business plan for our country. What I saw last night was a country living on the edge of its seat, waiting to see where the budget was going to go to give us indicators of where we were headed. And in my head, I was always taught, you don't drive a business by the dollars, you drive a business by the vision you're trying to create. So would you care to comment on what I've just said?
I think that is a pretty good summary of where we are. And it seems to be a philosophical position of the Morrison government not to want to do it, to have faith in the free market, which, you know, yeah, I've got faith in the free market too, that it responds to stimulus and to being pointed in the right direction. But it has been announced by the Prime Minister that they don't want to really lead. They want to sit back and let private enterprise do whatever private enterprise wants to do, with the incentives and the leadership very short term. Now, the reality is Australia has not been keeping up its pace for the thick end of a decade. Business has not been investing in the way we need to invest because the clear pathway is not there. And if the private sector isn't doing it for one reason or another, that it's too lazy, it's not competitive enough, it's up to the public sector to provide the leadership and provide the money. If we had faith in a government that was investing in the country rather than handing out band-aids along the way, maybe we would see more investment by business in our future. In the end, all a government can do is invest in its people. All you can do is invest in people and the infrastructure, and then get the economy going along the path that it needs to go on. As I pointed out in that higher education slide, we're not investing in tertiary education in any meaningful way. We're going backwards in what we spend in our universities. We are leaving it to short-term policies to go out and buy a new laptop go out and buy a new Hilux, but in the long term, it's not there. Similarly, with our climate policy, it's often the never, never. There's no urgency to it. There is more urgency in the private sector than the federal government, and at a state level. So the leadership's not there. Some keen people will get on the bandwagon, but everyone else is being told you don't need to. It's going to be taken care of magically somewhere in the future, way beyond the term of this in the next government.
Mm. Thank you, Michael. I think that's an incredible kind of summary to end on. I think coming from politics, from the position that I do, I look at the role of our federal government, I feel with clear eyes, and the three key functions I think a federal government should be providing to our country is leadership. If they don't lead, who does? And it really resonates with me what you're saying about sending those strong signals about where we're investing. Coordination across our federated country, so ensure we're not having to relearn the same mistakes again and again, and actually oiling those rails, if you like. And then definitely stimulation where it's required, and investment to make sure that again we're sending those right triggers. What I would finish on saying is that it sounds to me too like there might just be a perfect opportunity in there for a private members bill to be put forward around accountability as it relates to budget promises, and actually legislating it as a requirement that, once a budget is promised, from what I can see currently, there is no clear process of reconciliation against what was promised, what's been achieved, before the next round of promises carry on. So do you feel like there would be space for that sort of thing?
Yes, there would be. We do have a parliamentary budget office where you can find out what the real numbers end up being spent, but it's not upfront. That greater accountability of what has been spent, rather than keep promising the same thing time and again, would be nice, would be helpful. That ability to hold the blowtorch to the belly of government, to be accountable for promises, what is spent, what is not spent, and where it's spent, is really what we want and need Parliament to do. And if Parliament doesn't have dare I say it, a strong independent leg to it, that gets lost in the political argy-bargy of the opposition always saying one thing and the government always saying the other. So I think independent pressure for accountability would be a good thing.
Perfect. Thank you, Michael. Thank you to everybody who's joined us this morning. I'm conscious we've gone a little bit over time, but I actually feel like I could sit and speak to Michael for another hour, but he's a very busy man, and I know all of you are as well. Just a reminder, if you would like to help us spread the word around this campaign, we have a couple of Meet the Candidate events coming up in the coming week. So I will be in Lane Cove on the 3rd of April, and then Artarmon on the 6th of April. We also have other events coming up in terms of coffee. As always, please feel free to get involved in the campaign. If you've not subscribed to our newsletter that goes out weekly, jump online at kylietink.com.au and subscribe to our newsletter, our social channels, and help us share this message across our electorate, that there is another way that politics can be done, and that the opinions and voices that are represented here in the electorate of North Sydney can play an incredibly important role in shaping the future of our country. We are a community of thinkers, doers, feelers, believers, dreamers, and achievers. And at the moment, the fact that our federal vote is being consistently lost and swamped by a party politic majority, I think is really denying not just ourselves, but our entire country momentum, which could be moving us forward to a better place. So please help me and all the people involved in Team Tink in sharing that opportunity across our electorate, because I fundamentally believe that together we can change the climate in Canberra, and we must change the climate in Canberra now for our kids and their kids. So again, thank you for joining both myself and Michael this morning, and please join me in a round of applause for Michael. And go forth and conquer today. Thank you, everyone.
Authorised by Kylea Tink, North Sydney, New South Wales.